done this in a long time, but I felt that today's program, it's very, very appropriate for me to let you guys know about the Friends of the Library. I see some new faces that I haven't seen before, because I know who signed up and who didn't. But we really, really appreciate if you become a friend of the library. You know, the ones who have heard me before know that we buy books for the children, entertainment, large print books for the seniors. We do the Foreign Film Festival. I could go on and on. We have the book cage. And we are just so, we have a holiday sale coming up in November. So I'm just, thank you, thank you. So all I'm saying is, please, if you'd like to become, I know you're all about 39, but we're gonna give a senior rate today. It's all of $10, and anything you'd like to give, we so appreciate. Enjoy the program. Thank you very much.
She's the hardest worker, I'm telling you. Thank you, Sandy, for everything that you do for South Orange.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming today. We have a very special guest, someone who has helped make South Orange such a wonderful place to live. Alex Torpey, former village president of South Orange, consultant, political figure, so talented, bright, and handsome. So he's going to catch us up to date with what he's been doing since Sheena has taken over. And I can't wait to hear your talk, Alex, and it's good to see you here again.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay. Before I begin, I always want to thank all of my fellow friends and librarians for all of their help and support for these programs. I couldn't do it without them. And now, please let's give a very warm welcome to our very wonderful and special guest, Alex.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. It's far too kind, but I appreciate it nonetheless. And as a former library board member, I'll also second the Friends of the Library pitch from earlier in the program. So what I was hoping to do today a little bit was tell just kind of a short story, and actually I'm more interested in having a little bit of a conversation about it and your reactions and thoughts. And the story is about community, and it's about people coming together to work towards kind of a shared vision, and that's something that seems like worth talking about, especially these days, especially what's happening around the country, around the world. It seems like we could use a little bit more stories about people coming together and working towards some sort of common good. I hear it too. I don't know. Is that me?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a hearing.
So the story is as follows. When my term finished, and I'll also say before I start actually that it was such an incredible experience to get to be in office in South Orange. So I grew up in Maplewood in South Orange. My parents moved out here from the city when I was about a year old, so I don't really remember. They claimed it was a very small apartment, and they didn't want to raise a family there. I believe them. And we moved to Maplewood first on Kendall Avenue, and then to Terrell, and that's where I grew up for middle school on. And so I have very, very incredibly fond memories of the middle schools and of Columbia High School and of growing up here and of playing Frisbee in the parking lot on Friday night and and then the police coming and saying you have to get out of here, and then a few years later somehow I'm in charge of it. Not really sure how that works. But it was really an incredible experience because I've gotten the opportunity to travel a little bit more, and even in those travels just meeting people from other places, and even when I went to college and meeting people from other places and hearing about different parts of the country and then being able to tell stories about South Orange and Maplewood, people were always fascinated. And not only did it usually kind of go against their stereotypes of New Jersey for whatever reason, thank you some TV shows for not really helping in that regard, but people were always fascinated to hear about what South Orange and Maplewood was like, and I managed to convince a lot of friends to come through here and visit and spend a little bit of time, and they would always comment on the same afterwards or say, I didn't really believe you, but now I do. This is really a unique place. And so it was a real incredible honor, really, to be able to be part of kind of contributing back towards that after being here for so long and getting so much out of it. So when my term finished last year, so it was in May of 2015, one of the things I had really wanted to do was kind of with my newfound freedom and time, which free time was like a word that hadn't really I hadn't known in years, and getting the opportunity to move around. And so I had the chance a couple years ago to visit for about a week in Rwanda, and it was some friends that were working there, and it was a really incredible experience And one of the things that I kind of promised myself is that when my term finished, that I wanted to go back and learn a little bit more. And the framework for it was that there was an organization that a friend of mine founded when she was 23 or 24 years old. And they do this incredible community development work that's all focused on helping people figure out how to make their community better, not coming in with some sort of, pre-identified solutions and saying, hey, here's what we're going to do. It's about helping people figure that out, helping people kind of learn to work together, put project plans together, put budgets together, and do all the things needed to kind of accomplish the goals that this organization helps them identify through this really long process. And it was incredible seeing this, because I participated in so many community meetings here in New Jersey and down in DC and down in Trenton, and that's not always the spirit of those meetings. Is like, okay, well, here are the folks who are going to benefit from this. We want you to completely own this project. We don't want to take anything, we don't want to have any ownership of it, we want you to decide what it is, and that there's a value in folks participating in that process themselves directly and seeing the results of participating in that process. So I promised myself I wanted to go back and learn a little bit more about that. So what I want to do is just tell a story about the second time that I visited, and then have a little bit of a conversation about that and what that means today and what sort of insights you all can share about what I think is a really important goal, which is figuring out a way to bring people together in making decisions, even if they're not the decisions we always 100% agree on. And so one of the, what I did when I went out there was a really kind of fun experience. After I finished in South Orange, I got the chance to take a little vacation, which was also a really new and fun and interesting thing, which I recommend to everybody. And I was in Spain with someone who I had started my company with about 5 years ago, and it was just like a beautiful, incredible experience. And then I went down and started kind of my next step of the journey back in Rwanda, and visited some of the same places that I had visited, about a year and a half prior. And eventually made my way to Uganda and was staying with a group, an organization that was doing work in a whole bunch of different communities there. And they would take me out to different communities, some that were very early on in the process, so they were thinking about what goals do the community has, what's their kind of shared vision, for where they want to be in 5 years or in 10 years. And then some communities that had already finished the projects that they had worked on, and where they were kind of moving on to their next project. And so this is a story about a community. Matoto is the name of the community. It's in eastern Uganda, kind of right on the border of Kenya. To get up to the community is like a 3-hour drive through like very rocky hills, and with someone's big truck, and that was really the only way that you could get up there other than on foot. And we got up there, and you have a view of all the mountains around you, and it's a small community of about maybe about 100 or 110 families. And it was always funny visiting communities in other parts of the world that also use the word village to describe the size of their community. And then coming from South Orange, so it's funny, we use the same word, it's a little bit of a different scale though. Although I think a lot of the important components of what a village is, in my opinion, are actually shared in all those places. So we went out there, and what this community had done was identified earning more revenue is the problem. There weren't enough jobs to go around, and with more revenue the families identified that they could buy healthcare that they needed, and make other investments in their own family and back into their own business, that they needed just basically kind of a kickstart to get things going, and that they could do the rest. But it was that small spark. And what they had identified as the best way to do that, based on the local markets and the price of different grains or farming or things like that, was that they could rear goats and sell the goat milk to surrounding communities, and that would earn enough revenue to be able to buy more and grow that, and that they would manage all of that, all the business aspects of that. So when we went out there, they had completed this project. And the young woman who had facilitated those meetings to help a lot of these community members kind of work this project out over the prior year, had mentioned that it was a really difficult community to work in, that there were, unlike some communities where they had already worked on projects together and there was some sort of shared trust already about working together for the whole community, these folks hadn't really had the opportunity to do that. There was a lot of division within the community, and a lot of kind of mistrust of people. And there's some sort of ethnic and class underlying issues that are really complicated. but that they wanted to address that and they wanted to figure out a way to help people realize that the best way to help all of them was to work together. So they did this project and they did it successfully. They had they showed us all of the different kind of pens where they were all kept and how they traded the management over, so each family took a different share of time, making sure that everything was taken care of. And actually, there was a little tiny goat baby born when we were standing there, which is quite a sight. That was the first time I'd seen something like that, is a tiny little goat about this big. And the community members were all incredibly proud of it. I mean, I had visited a lot of places like this, but there was something particularly special about this place and how much pride they clearly felt over the accomplishments they did make. And they had already started planning their next project, which was to rebuild one of the schools in the community, and they were doing that without the help of any outside organization whatsoever. They were doing that, planning everything out, working on everything on their own, which is pretty amazing. And so they showed us all around, and the elected officials in the village, were, like I mentioned, kind of showing everything off and talking about how they did all this and how it's still working. And they brought all the people who had participated in the project back together for kind of a larger community meeting. And they shared some of their stories, and we got to ask some questions and have a conversation. And one of the questions that I asked the community members was, so this project was so successful, what's your advice for other people who want to do this? I mean, you've kind of shown a great example, and in one word, so to say, what would your advice be? And in a community, especially where women didn't always have the opportunity to participate to the same degree that men did, a woman stood up and, without kind of asking or anything, just stood up and said unity, and sat back down, and everybody kind of gave her applause and cheered her on a little bit. And it just kind of stuck with me for a moment as we're driving back. I was thinking, she said that with such conviction. It wasn't a conversation. Oh, here's a PowerPoint of the 3 things that we did right. Here's the advice. No, it was one word. It was the simplest possible word, but also a really powerful one. And so we're driving back to the house, and I remember later that night went out to dinner and came back, and remember going back on Facebook for the first time that day. And this was, mind you, this was over a year ago, and it was just news about what was happening with the presidential election, and without mentioning any names, just a lot of negative stuff, and a lot of people arguing, and people that I know, friends of mine, who I know care more than some of the things that they might write online, the way it seems, were just kind of fighting against each other. People in the same country, people in the same state, people in the same town, people of the same political party, people of the same goals were fighting with each other, and not fighting as in, no, actually I think this is the best way to approach that problem, and here's my evidence, and and have you had a chance to look at that, and can we talk about it? It was a personal, and that brought me back to some of the early conversations that even happened here in South Orange, where every once in a while, there was just an injection of kind of personal politics into town, which I think has been one of the greatest marks of progress over the last several years, which is that the space around making decisions in South Orange is so much more positive than it used to be. There's more people that are involved, and even from what I see now, being out of office, it's more constructive. But I went back and I looked at this and I said, this is amazing that that we're doing this, and this word unity, even though it's in the name of our country, the United States, it's not part of our everyday lives. It's not part of all of our conversations. It's not part of the way that we make decisions. It's not part of the way that we elect people. We have something that almost creates the opposite of that, which is intentionally dividing people, so that you can claim a group and say, this is my group, and group, let's accomplish these goals, and forget that group. They don't care about us, and they don't know anything. And there's too much of that, and it just really took me back to part of the reasons why I wanted to get involved in this in high school and in college, and when I came back from college, getting involved in South Orange was just this feeling that we're missing an opportunity with not finding some way to bring people together in a more tangible fashion, especially around making political decisions. And so I got this opportunity to start teaching at Seton Hall a couple years ago. And one of the subjects that the professor that I started teaching with really loves to talk about is social capital in a culture or in a society, and how that's changing, and how the internet is kind of contributing to some of those changes. And there was one topic that we always enjoyed talking about in our class, and this is kind of what I wanted to throw out there and see if we could sort of have a conversation about. And the way that he framed it was the difference between bonding capital and bridging capital, and that bonding capital were things that brought groups closer within a group, and that bridging capital were things that brought different groups together. And they were kind of more external focused, whereas there's other things that could be kind of more internal focused. And a lot of what happens online, a lot of what I see young people, participating in on, I don't, regular basis doesn't seem to quite, it seems like an underestimate of how much time people spend online. And a lot of those things are very personalized. You see things from people you agree with, and newscasters 20 or 30 years ago had a really broad audience that they had to talk to, and now they don't, right? They can have a very, very narrow audience because they can talk to anybody in the country. And it's created this like, okay, well, here's my kind of kingdom, and we're just going to keep doing that, and I'm going to keep building that audience and those ideas, and it's just very insular, and it just builds on itself over time, and everybody's doing that, but there's something that's not bringing all of those different things together. And so when I had that experience in Uganda, it was just kind of a, it was just a reminder of how important thinking about that was, and when I came back here and looked at what I wanted to do next, now that I have all this time to work at a job and earn a salary, which was really exciting, and I had a company that I had started years ago, working around here when I was in high school and college, and I left the company and basically am now trying to figure out ways to address that, and so thinking about getting more young people to run for office. But in a way that's not based on an ideology. It's not based on, hey, we believe the same sorts of things about the way things have to work, but hey, you're someone who honestly believes things, let's all do this. And it's kind of a step beyond trying to broaden that net a little bit, and just seems like a topic worth talking about at a time when I feel like there's just too many forces that are separating people and highlighting our differences and highlighting things that we're divided about and not talking about the opposite of that, which there are many of. So with that, I kind of wanted to open it up. Of course, if people have questions about anything, I'm happy, but I'd also love to hear any stories if anybody here had similar experiences like that you remember was kind of part of your life that was formative, saying, this made me kind of, better take this value as part of what I want to do with my work or with my life. And so that's what I'd love to hear some stories and respond to them and talk about them.
I have one question.
Sure.
How much does religion play in this? Because I would imagine that the people who believe in a certain belief, then they could go on and do other things with this same thought.
Right. I think it plays a big part, but I think it's a subset of the way that where people derive their values from, and that could come from a bunch of different places. And their religion is one of them, their family is one of them, where they grew up is one of them. There are all these different factors that could influence that. But the funny thing about any sort of identity, whether it be a religion or a political affiliation, or a background, or gender, or an ethnicity. So I feel like there are people on all sides of any issue in most of those groups. And that there are, more commonalities there than not, and that regardless of what someone's identity is in one of those categories, it doesn't necessarily define the way that they act with everything. It might be a part of them that integrates with other parts of them. I'm not sure if that really answers the question anyway, or almost asks a more complicated question.
No, because I was just thinking how much
Speak up, please, 'cause
the commonality, in
Mhm.
other words, of someone. What you said is true probably. In Israel, there's so many different sects, no matter what the religion. So maybe that, But at what point can you get these people to be inspired
Right.
to do better when making a living is so difficult now?
Right. Well, and I think that's probably one of the kinds of questions that the woman who started this organization asked, which was, there has to be some initial step that we're not providing for. And it's not different necessarily in another part of the world versus a city here in the United States, where people don't have access to economic opportunity the way that they should. And that limits your access to having political opportunity, and that limits your access to having education opportunity, and all of these things, and they stem from, I don't know, an economy that's changing and we're not addressing it, an economy where, the jobs that used to exist in a lot of parts of the country are never coming back, and I don't think there's people of either party that necessarily have a solution for bringing those jobs back versus trying to figure out a new way to do something. And the ideas of citizens in a country, there's different ideas out there. There's guaranteed basic incomes where there are no social welfare programs, but everybody gets a check from the government, and that is a way to provide a baseline that every single person, regardless of their age or background or anything about them, has a baseline and they can cover their basic needs, and that makes you able to start your own business or move from job to job. And especially if you have your health care that's not tied to your job and you can move around. There's just all these limitations in place that prevent people from doing that. And I think it's just finding what of those things are the biggest contributor to the problem in any given place. And it seems like in most parts of the world it's that basic first step towards economic mobility and being able to take pride in a business that you own and being able to feel that you're providing for your family and being able to feel that you're safe. Not just physically, but also economically. But I think that, if there's an example to learn from the US, I think one of the examples is that, the history of our country is so complicated, but there's an aspect of it that seems very different than most other parts of the world, which was that most governments in most countries, and I'm certainly not a world history scholar by any stretch, but most governments were started when that government took control from the previous government. And it was basically a more singular idea that became that government and that became the country going forward. Whereas this country, when it was founded, certainly not everybody was at the table by any stretch, but there were people who had very different ideas of what the country was supposed to be, whether small states and big states and proportional representation or not, and all these different questions were asked because people had very different interests, but they were all at the table. They were in Philadelphia and they were working this out, and they did work it out, and they created the Constitution, which is an incredible document that is, like anything else, not perfect, but has provided this foundation. And I think if we have something to learn from that, it's a very roundabout way of kind of answering this question, is that the diversity that existed at that place, which was people who had different ideas about what to do, we need to build on and basically appreciate. That decision-making environments shouldn't be, when our side takes control, we'll do everything right. It should be, both sides should be able to work out a solution on what's right on all of these different things. And that's what we did at one point, and we made a really big step forward. And I think that we're at a time in our country and a time in the world where it seems like people are looking for public leadership. And it'd be nice to see, our public leaders kind of take that same, attitude and say, well, the differences don't matter as much. And actually, our differences are what will make our decision really strong, because we're not going to allow anything to slip by. And to appreciate being able to put those different types of people together. And that's a value that I learned in South Orange and Maplewood, was that diversity is not something that is like an abstract concept that you can kind of be for diversity or pro-diversity. It's a foundational way of life. And if we don't provide for that in our communities and we don't provide for that in our political space, then we're all missing out on the kinds of decisions we can make. Yeah, sure.
It seems to me that, I don't know whether it was Thomas Paine or one of the founding fathers talked about the common good.
Right.
That is what you're talking about. And that we have, someplace along the way, lost that view of the common good. That, and I don't know how to define the common good, but it seems to me that it was a coming together of all the things that you talked about, and we haven't decided. At this point, right now, we seem to be so torn apart rather than being able to even cross the aisle and say, let's talk about it. I mean, we've lost the sight of what we were founded on.
What do you think has contributed to that?
Ego.
Ego?
I think, and unfortunately, the diversity in the economic situation. And when we think about the people who sat down in Philadelphia, they too were of the most educated, they had the most worldly goods, and yet, you know, and of course we were built on a slave population. But there was something there that they were looking for these diverse colonies.
Relating to what you were saying, there was something I was reading the other day that suggested that during the founding of our country, the emphasis was on freedom from oppression, which is what the Declaration of Independence puts forth. They list all of the things that the colonists felt that they were oppressed by. So the emphasis was on setting up a governing body that would address this freedom from oppression, and they were very sensitive about being oppressed, hence the Bill of Rights came about and that sensitivity. But as the political field evolved, it became more about the landscape, which is evolved more into freedom of opportunity. And that's what is addressed more during the debates and the different people putting in opinions about how best the country should function to provide the most opportunity. People are less concerned about that oppressive quality that they used to be, and about opportunities.
Well,
Different groups have different ideas of what is a good opportunity for it.
Right, and it seems like different groups have different, you know, there's maybe a spectrum that people fall along. Because one of the things that I'm curious, your reaction or anybody else's as well, one of the things that seems to be underlying in a lot of what's happening in kind of national political discourse right now is sometimes subtle and sometimes not subtle, the way that people use freedom as kind of as a piece of leverage for other things, right? Is that, you know, there is this idea, and maybe it's freedom, maybe there's some linkage between the economic opportunity that people want, and that we still have this, you know, very ingrained as part of us. Anybody's, you know, could be the millionaire one day, you know, and I think that attitude existing, so that attitude existing creates that feeling, and what the oppression and opportunity mix seems to be now is freedom from, the ability to have economic opportunity only comes when you're free from the government preventing you from doing that. You know, that's you know, an attitude or a feeling in a lot of this country right now that seems like an odd mix of those things, where it's like, well, we want you to have economic opportunity, but it's not that, you know, it's not that you're not being able to afford college is preventing that. It's not that you know, you not having access to a mass transit system to get to a near city so you could have more job opportunities. It's that the government is preventing those, you know, preventing that economic opportunity from happening. And that there's a large segment of the country that believes that that's the case. And there's you know, one of the candidates for president talks a lot about that. So how do we address that kind of like almost mixing the fear with oppression and allowing people to desire economic opportunity, but in a different context, maybe? Sure.
Yeah, hi, I'm glad you brought up the political part of it. I can't help but thinking about the vice presidential debate the other night, and when Mr. Pence said something, and very eloquently, about his feeling about the right to life. And if I heard him correctly, I heard him say that this is in his heart and the way he feels, and he cannot go against his education, his background, and his feeling, and this would be it. Well, there's another part of the population here that, respects what he says, but lives or wants to live differently. So here we're tearing apart a country, and I'm not going to act politically who by what, but you can guess who I'm for. What will happen if Mr. Trump becomes president and you have a Governor Pence, Mr. Pence, there, and how he's going to use his strength, I hate to use the word power, but how he will use his strength in pushing forward beside the Supreme Court, his feeling and his philosophy on the right to life.
Here, you should come up and, no, I think that's a very insightful comment.
Sorry it took so long.
No, not at all, yeah.
I have an answer to this lovely lady. The point is with Mike Pence is that if he's going to be a candidate for vice president, he's got to remember that he's got to take an oath of office to obey the Constitution and the laws of the United States. And therefore, he would be at total odds as to that. Because he couldn't take office if he were going to follow what he just said. It would be totally ridiculous. Because he couldn't do that unless they changed Roe versus Wade at that point. But that would be far in the future. So
Not that far in the future.
it doesn't happen like that.
What you need is one Supreme Court
I know.
justice on the other side,
I
and
know,
it
but
could be
you've
gone.
got, how long have we been at 4x4?
Yeah, but we have an empty seat.
We have an empty seat and they can't fill it because of the situation.
It could be months till you have a new justice who would give you a conservative
Absolutely,
majority.
exactly my point.
So
Exactly
it's
my
not
point, you're
far in
making
the
my point.
future, that's what I'm
It
saying.
could be far in the future,
Okay, now we have
exactly.
differences of opinion, right?
Right, well, and I think that our, part of, the challenge that we all have is that the level of uncertainty that everybody feels about what's going to happen is not the right way to bring a country to get, people don't want, right, exactly. And, economic uncertainty or social uncertainty or political uncertainty or any of these things are very toxic in the way that we, in the way that we live on our daily lives. And, and I think that all these kind of structures that we create, it's just, the environment that we're creating in a lot of colleges and a lot of classrooms, I think even, and it's certainly, if you look at the news, is that everybody has a community and that all these communities are just basically separate and let's just put the gate around it and we'll just all live separately, except that we can't do that. And there's some not appreciation of the fact that if we wanted to do that, then there has to be a way to compromise things that we really care about. And I don't know how to talk about that, I don't know how to ask people to do something like that, but it seems like something that might have to be done, which is that, if we're gonna govern, think about governing in a way, not just the country, but the state of New Jersey right now is fighting to figure out how to repair our transit infrastructure, which is a problem that is many years. We've been complaining in South Orange to the governor's office and to the state legislature for years. That basically hey, we're telling people they can move to South Orange and commute into the city, but the last couple mornings, and part of this is due to the Hoboken and still having not worked those problems out, but there's not really a lot more capacity left, and there's people moving out here, and so our economic future in this community, how do we keep taxes to a level that is not any worse than it already is, at least. It's very difficult, and building on some of these properties right around the train station is a good way to do that. But the sell is that you're connected, in an artery right into New York City. And if that's not the case, all of these communities around, in New York metropolitan areas are all struggling, and they don't know what the future is going to hold either. Is there going to be a second tunnel built? Is there not? And it's just in every aspect of decisions, I feel like there's just an unknown about what we're going to do in the future. And I don't know, it didn't seem like, my only reflection on history obviously could be from reading it or learning about it as best as possible, talking to people, but it seems like the uncertainty at other points in histories and in other parts of the world now, that the uncertain aspect is something that's exciting and hopeful, and not something that's frightening and and something that we're not. There's some way to look at that uncertainty in a positive light, but that doesn't really. That doesn't usually help. It doesn't solve the problem, but I think that what's amazing is that what a lot of people look at and what's easy to see is the kind of disagreements, especially in national politics. What's easy to miss in a lot of cases, and a lot of the work that I've been trying to do over the last year is working with local elected officials around the country who are doing really great work. But their stories don't get told because it's not as exciting as someone tweeting at someone else at 3 in the morning. And it's like, why do we really even care about all of this? There are people in government that are solving real problems, mayors and council people and school boards around the country. There was a young mayor up in Ithaca, New York, and they have a really, as a lot of places are having these growing problems, but a really big problem with heroin. And they are the only city in the country now where they have a public facility where they actually provide not only needles but heroin to drug users, and they found that the percentage of people that go into social service programs is much, much greater when people have access to clean spaces and when there's social workers there and talking with people about it, and they get to know these people over many months. And there was a couple of facilities in Canada that did this, and they significantly reduced crime and significantly reduced diseases that were spread by needles and reduced drug addiction. And they did all of this, and those people can now theoretically come back into this economy that we still have to figure out a way to rebuild and create jobs in, but now they can kind of participate in that by doing a program that everybody in that city was very nervous, the police chief, everybody was very nervous about it, and they spent a lot of time studying it and looking into it and said, okay, we've got to do something. And putting people in jail and traditional treatment programs aren't working, so what else can we do? And those sorts of things, it's just such a risky idea, but it's such a creative idea. The United States itself was a risky idea, but a creative idea. And it seems like those are the only ideas that really solve major problems, is ones that are a little bit risky and a little bit creative, but our political environment makes it very hard for people to make decisions like that because they're worried about what's going to happen in the next election. Yeah.
I have a comment about the heroin issue, and then I have another local question. So it was an interview on Wharton radio station where somebody had studied the heroin addiction, which is actually escalating at monumental numbers with people in our age category who are taking painkillers after whatever incident we had. And so that's a real issue, and it started because the FDA approved OxyContin and they hadn't tested it. And so how do we as a collective society hold the FDA accountable for creating this epidemic when it's going to hit our communities to the vast extent that it has? So that's just one commentary. My question to you is the Bridgegate situation. Finally, the Star Ledger yesterday said that it was the specific intention of the intergovernmental agency to curry the favor and the endorsement of Democrats, which they did. That's really the story. Bridgegate is not an aberration, it was just the typical operation. So we have Parks because DiVincenzo, and this is politics forever. However, I'm trying to figure out if this is unprecedented that Christie just picked on the Democrats, because I recognized that night how many Democrats supported him, and I thought it was a really odd pattern. Do you know if that particular kind of style of getting support for a second election has been used with your opponent's party before?
Yeah, it definitely has been. I think what our governor did was pretty similar to what a lot of politicians, especially in New Jersey, do. There's a couple interesting contexts that I can share from South Orange. One is that because we're not a partisan, we don't have a partisan election, we fortunately get left out of a lot of this kind of stuff, which is I'm happy to be left out of those things. Two is that because I am not affiliated with a party and never really cared to go out and go to political events and endorse people and do all that kind of stuff, that after a year or two of kind of telling people no and not showing up for things, people stopped inviting me, which was also fine. It gave me more time to do work, a funny thing. So there's a couple interesting thoughts here, maybe. One is that I think that a lot of the pressures I could put on people in these positions, it's very easy to feel like someone like Christy is, like, oh, this is where it all starts and ends. And you mentioned that it was kind of larger than that, and I think that is a takeaway that I'm not sure is getting told as much as it needs to, right? Which is that this isn't a personal issue, this is a systemic issue. This is the way that this works, and even on small levels, like let's forget closing bridges and governors and port authorities, right? Look at, mayors and redevelopers is, especially in New Jersey, is one of the areas that I know when I got advice before I ran, one of the advice that someone gave me was, don't ever have lunch with a developer by yourself. I said, always have somebody else with you so that you can have a witness if something happens. I said, don't ever let them, pay for anything, and that kind of stuff was sort of common sense. But that also makes it really difficult because, I was paycheck to paycheck with my own company, not pulling, any salary or anything from South Orange. And so I was like, oh, come get lunch with me. And I'm like, I would really like to, but I can't afford to pay my half if I have to do that, which I have to do that. And the only time that I actually had like a confrontation with somebody was, there was only one time where this happened, but someone said, oh, let me grab that. And I said, no, like, we could just split it, it's fine. I said, no, please, like, let me do it. And I'm like, no, I'd rather pay the half, here's, get the cash out. And, usually at that point, I think social decorum, okay, we're not gonna fight over this. But he, kind of kept at it, and we ended up splitting it, but it created a very uncomfortable situation. Something that was just like, I was like, well, why wouldn't I always do this? And why are you expecting me not to? And this situation itself doesn't really matter. I'd be surprised if anyone ever changed a vote for a sandwich. But that's not really the point, right? The point is the culture. The point is the expectations, the point is what's tolerated, the point is where people draw lines. And we have a very funny, you look at like the way legislative districts are drawn and they're all over the place, that's how a lot of people draw their like ethical lines. They're not like a straight line, and here's the bad side, here's the good side. It's like, well, I'll make a little bit of a compromise here, but not over here, but it's definitely over here. And it's like very hard to navigate that. And I think that happens because people get elected and the pressures get put on them from other people, and they want to do good work, and so they want the, whatever reward is being hung over them, maybe not even for them personally, but for their community. There was a mayor who got arrested years ago. It was might have been Peter Camerano in Hoboken, who had taken money, I forget exactly the circumstances, but he used that money to pay debts that his campaign had collected. It wasn't money for himself personally, it all went to pay off the campaign that he just ran. And it's like, well, what does that mean? That elections cost so much that this is something that someone is willing to do to pay for running for office? And like, but these things exist, and we just kind of like roll over them each time until something really big happens, and until you get like a perfect storm of you have someone like Governor Christie who has a personality that makes this a very compelling narrative, because he is very angry and loud and kind of a bully and whatnot. And you have different political issues, it just all kind of comes together, and now it's something that we're going to address, but I'm afraid that we're not going to address the long-term cause, which is all of the way these rules are structured and the way that business gets done in politics in New Jersey, and in a lot of places, that it's just going to keep continuing. The next person will, they'll cover their tracks a little bit better, they'll be a little bit less bullish about it, but the way that endorsements go and the way people get chosen for elections, it's one of the things that I've heard from the most in interviewing young people about why they don't want to run for office. They talk about the way that candidates get selected by larger parties, county parties or state parties to run for Congress, for instance. And it's primarily about, how much money can that person raise. And if we have to run, 50 congressional races, and this person can raise $1 million on their own, and that just saved us $1 million. It's great. And that's not a good reason for someone to be in Congress. That specific thing, that they have $1 million, that doesn't really go any which way. But that's the way that it's created. And so a lot of people shy away from it who don't want to get involved in those things because they see that it's not very merit-based. That it's based on these different deals, and a lot of young people I know don't want to participate. They don't feel right doing it. They don't know how to confront those decisions, and so they don't participate. And then we're left with the people who do that, running the show, and that's the real problem, I think. Yeah.
You mentioned in your business, how do you find these idealistic, young, bright people?
Yeah, so the consulting that I'm doing right now is with an organization called Run for America, and what they do is a bipartisan organization, and last year they were focused on recruiting people to run for the House of Representatives, and this year we're looking at basically, instead of trying to help someone run for a specific type of office, providing an environment to help them realize what type of office they might want to run for. And so there's no partisan affiliation, there's no office, anything. We're going to create this environment, we're going to help people talk about it. To get people funneled into that, there was, I mean, just on a practical level, there was a whole bunch of people for many months doing research, trying to find stories in local newspapers about people that were doing interesting projects or that had made a list of, young entrepreneurs doing social good, on some place in, some website in Phoenix, Arizona, and we'll research that, look at the person, try and find them on LinkedIn or on Facebook or places like that, and then put them into a list, and we're just gonna ask them, all of them. So the idea is basically that we're trying to cast as wide of a net as possible, and that if you do that, the kinds of people that we're likely to kind of pull up at the end are gonna be really exceptional people. And I've met a lot of those people when I've gotten to travel around, and young council people and young mayors. I mean, I had met a mayor who won. So when I ran in South Orange, it was, I don't know if, I will never forget this moment, but the election night, and what ended up turning into a 12-vote victory, which I was shocked by how close that was and kind of terrified, because it's basically a wash. I mean, it's basically you didn't win or lose. It's so close that, I took that just as a personal note as like, okay, well, that was lucky. And not take that for granted. I met a mayor who won by 3 votes. And one of them was the ballot that said that 18-year-old kid. And the election board said, okay, well, we'll count that one for you. And that was the 3rd vote. And he did a lot of great work, and he's working actually in a different city now. And oddly enough, his actually father is the mayor of the town now, which is really interesting. Usually it goes, father-son or mother-daughter, not the other way around. And he's working in a city, and he loves doing the work. And there's all these people like that that are just doing interesting things, but they're so busy. I mean, they don't have time to plan how to reach out to other people. I mean, somebody has to do the connecting. And so there's some organizations that we've worked with and that I've worked with that try and do that connecting and basically say, all right, well, here are different organizations that do recruitment, and we're going to bring all these people in. But the idea is that the space is just not, it's not an ideological partisan space. It's a space where there are values, but the values are about running for office as a service, not as a career. And so we talk a lot about young people who join the Peace Corps or AmeriCorps or the military, and they don't make a lot of money, and it's a pretty hard job, dangerous, a lot of those jobs, but they commit to doing this. They commit to doing it because they know that there's a value in the work, and they know that there's a value for themselves in the future by doing whatever that is. And what I would hope is that we can create that same type of thinking around running for office, right? That it's not something that you do and you just keep doing it and keep running for higher offices and that's all you do, but you do it, you block this couple-year timeout, you don't have to run for re-election necessarily, you can do a lot of good work in 2 or 3 or 4 years, especially on the local level, then you get that great experience, and then you can take that experience and go do whatever you want with it. And if we can change that thinking a little bit, maybe that would change the kinds of people that run for office, and then maybe that would change the way that people behave when they're there. Because in that situation with me with that sandwich, it doesn't matter. I mean, there's no way I'm ever going to cross that line. There's nothing anyone can ever do to do anything. I would rather, lose the position, whatever. That's nowhere near as important to me as maintaining what I believe is right and wrong. And there are tons of people like that in the world, but because they're like that, I think they stay away from politics because they know how kind of crazy it is, and they don't know that you can put those lines up and you can act in a way that is based on your own values, but you just have to be ready to sacrifice the job that you have in doing that.
This was so interesting. Wow.
Sure.
I'm sorry. I was just thinking with all your talking that maybe the one thing we should unite around is getting private money out of the election process. That if indeed it meant just checking a box on your income tax, your $1 or $5, whatever it is. But would it not help these young people to be able to get into politics if in fact we did not have this money that gets into elections, that comes from who knows where, that brings what kind of pressures from who knows whom. And so I would think that would be something to unite around. Let's get rid of Citizens United or whatever allows this to happen.
So I personally agree that that's a super,
The
yeah,
Supreme Court ruled otherwise.
right. So the difficulty, right, is working within the framework that we have to try and get to a new framework.
Right.
And I agree, I think this is one of the most, you could almost kind of call it like a meta issue. Before you can solve all the other issues, if this isn't solved, it's going to keep affecting everything. And I think there is a lot of bipartisanship around this, but in a good way and a bad way. The bad way, right, is that both parties of people who are already elected benefit from it being this way, and it's a bipartisan benefit. Not a good one, but it's very hard to convince people, especially if they are already in office and they're going to have to run again and they're going to have to raise the money. It's a bit of a prisoner's dilemma, right? If you could do better, but you're going to raise less, and your opponent doesn't, now you've lost the seat, and you've lost the seat to someone who, based on your judgment, is going to not do as good of a job as you. And that's a hard kind of truth. But there's also the good side, which is that I think there's bipartisan support for doing something different. And I'm not sure exactly what form that takes. I think there's a couple different specific things that people have tried. One is that in municipal elections, in cities, you do have, the cities themselves have more control over what people can raise and write and providing public funding support and things like that. Right? Changing federal guidelines for these things is incredibly difficult because Congress would have to pass that, and I can't imagine that happening anytime soon, unfortunately. But I also think there is another way to do this, and it is to do things like, one of the ideas that we've kind of floated out around some of my work is, people running for office, but basically kind of going, figuring out a way to build a better idea on top of the laws that exist now. And so right now, you have to report if someone contributes over a certain amount into your campaign. It's like $300 in New Jersey. And you have to report that. But those reporting limits, and there's a max, right, for the entire election cycle. But there's obviously now the huge way around that with PACs and super PACs and all these different political organizations that you can use to kind of funnel money. But those organizations sprang up largely because the reporting limit pushed them a little bit in that direction. And there's so much money at stake that people are going to find a legal loophole. That's been clear that we've been kind of chasing that. So I think it's kind of like, the only way I can kind of think about visualizing this is almost like kind of doubling back on it, right? And saying, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to, you're going to have a candidate running for office, and you're going to have them, as delicately as possible, have some expert lawyers set up an account that they're going to use for running for office, and it'll be one of these PACs that can allow anonymous contributions, but that they're going to release the names of every single contributor, which you're certainly free to do, right? Why would you? And basically say, okay, well, we're going to raise money for our campaign by allowing anyone who contributes to contribute in a limited amount if they want to, but everything down to $1 we're going to publish, and the only people that will take money from are people. No organizations, no special interest groups, no political parties, nothing like that. Just money from people, but as much money as they want, but they have to sign their name to it. And that is not in my opinion, is not the solution, but I think it might be a step in the right direction to basically say, okay, let's put a spotlight on the way this is working, and show people, set an example for how it could be done, that would allow people to influence elections, as they do, in a way that's easier than it is now, but we just have to kind of know where the influence is coming from. And so there's ideas like that, and I have no idea if that's the best idea or the right idea, but there are people that are trying to play with these different dials to figure out, could you do this in a way that's better than what it is now, but still operates within this framework? Could we get money out of a local election and then, have that person, be an advocate on a larger level for doing it on the state level and work your way up. But there has to be some way to address
Yeah.
this
Sure.
versus what we have now. Yeah.
Can you see yourself going into politics, being the leader and becoming a mayor, governor, president?
Well, I joked with, I was joking with one of my friends that, cause I've been spending a little bit of time traveling around other countries, but then also here in the US, and I'm hoping that I'm gonna get to take at some point a 2-month trip, not for a while, cause I have this, the work that we're doing is for the next election cycle, so we've got a lot of work to put in there, but at some point wanna spend time visiting around all these different communities in the US, and basically just kind of like stopping into small towns and places and kind of ask like, hey, like how are things going? What are you working on? Like what can I learn from what you're doing here? Because some things we got to learn from somewhere, and I don't know where. And so I just kind of want to ask everybody. And so the answer, so that the joke was like it could be like a little like traveling mayor, and you kind of go around and you say, but then that a little bit of carpetbaggery as part of that. But so the answer is, this is what I want to work on. I want to work on this. I'm planning on probably going to law school next year, and to spend a little more time getting to study some of this in greater detail. But I would imagine that at some point in my life I would be running for office again. But I'm really enjoying, not doing that right now.
I'll vote for you.
Thank you. It was like such an amazing experience, but it's so, especially, here in town, and for me personally, just having grown up here and being on the rescue squad and being in the village, it was just like, and trying to start a company and pay my rent at the same time was just, almost impossible. I mean, it was impossible at times actually. And so that aspect of it I don't miss as much. But the aspect of getting to be doing the work on a daily basis is something I do miss. And so I'd be surprised if I don't do that again. But for the foreseeable future, like I'm in a point where I feel like I've learned a lot from South Orange and learned a lot from other places and learned a lot from these dealings with people in New Jersey and how politics works and doesn't work and how it should work. And I want to spend more time kind of studying that and more time helping other people like get to the point of feeling a little more confident about the way things are put together. Because one of the things that people mention as the biggest roadblock is that they say, oh, like, but if you run for office, don't you have to be corrupt? And it's like, and I hear that from young people that I talk to, and like, this is so terrible that that's the first thought, or they think they're going to have to do things that, yes, people do them, but you don't have to do them, right? They're doing them because they have a specific set of goals. They're doing them because they're going to run for this office, they have to win the support of this party boss and that party boss, and then get those people to support them in the next campaign, and you just have to keep building that like kingdom, right? But if that's not what you're doing, the things that motivate you, your incentive structure is completely different, right? I didn't feel that pressure because I knew that I wasn't going to run again in South Orange, and I knew that when, before I got sworn in, I put a couple dates in my calendar, and one of them was the swearing-in date, and then the next one was swearing in the next person. And I was like, this is how much time I have. If for some reason I decide I want to run again at some point in the future, I'm not going to promise myself I won't, but this is what I'm planning on doing, is this 1 4-year period of time, and it just made me, I wasn't worried about not, people, party boss type people would call and say, are you coming to this event to endorse people? And I said, no, I'm sorry, I've got something tonight, I've got to be at the rescue squad tonight. They say, oh, okay, that's fine. Yeah.
I'm just thinking, first of all, I think you'd have my vote if you ran.
Thank you.
Think about it. I'm thinking, in watching the discussion last night, Pence, or the night before, the journalists were saying that he's going to possibly run for the presidency in 20, and that's why he was working on appearing cool, and he also does a radio program, so he was prepared to present himself as a prospective candidate in 20, and I thought how sad we are not finished here,
Right.
and they're already talking about what's going to come up. And also, money. You need a lot of money to run for any office, generally.
So that's pretty sad, and that's where we are now, which I'm disturbed about.
I mean, for whatever it's worth, I agree that that's a major problem. I do think that there are a lot of people, and and I have a bias in it because the work that I'm doing is talking to these types of people all the time, young people that are interested in getting involved, but they're not really sure, but they don't really know how they want to do it. So I hear a lot of people and kind of their stories that are antithetical to that, which that they don't want to do it that way, right? They're frustrated by it. I mean, The West Wing is like one of my favorite shows, but when I go back and watch it, which is often, there's a lot of politicking in the show in a way that I don't really agree with. And I think that at periods of time, it actually worked to some degree, that you had parties that exerted some kind of control over all of their members, and there was an investment in the long term, and that made you kind of compromise along the way to get to the chair of the whatever committee. And now it's a little bit chaos. In that legislature, right? The parties have lost a lot of the control they used to have. People are all kind of running around, and everybody wants to run for president. Everybody wants to run for something, and that's what everybody's focused on. And it's so frustrating. So I was at a panel a couple weeks ago in the city that the Brookings Institute did about the refugee crises all around the world and in Africa and Europe, and what they had. One of the kind of theme of the event was, I'm not going to put it exactly as well as they did, but they said, refugees don't just come to nations, they come to cities, and then that's where they live. And so let's look at what all the cities all around the world are doing. Nations have debates about refugees or immigration, and it tends to be very kind of conceptual, right? It tends to be a lot of xenophobia, and it tends to be a lot of things like that, and it tends to be national identity and pathway to citizenships. But cities have to provide education, have to provide jobs, have to provide safety, have to provide places for people to live in communities where you don't put refugees of all one country in one place, but you don't want to split everybody up. How do you figure out a way to do that in a way that helps them integrate and grow, but doesn't create enclaves that are specific to one place? And it's this incredibly complicated process, and cities are doing all of that work, right? National governments aren't doing that work as much. They might write some checks to the cities to pay for those programs, but there are brilliant people all around the world that are trying to figure out new ways to do this, but it's all happening on city levels. And so something that I certainly felt kind of before I ran, and I've become a bigger believer in since then, is that we basically just need to turn our attention back to what's happening in our communities, right? And that doesn't mean not paying attention at all to what's happening in the presidential election or not voting or anything like that. It means that that is not where the solution is going to come from. Right, the solution isn't going to come on a November election day and then everything's going to be fine. The solution is going to come from a decade from now or 2 decades from now, all this work happening in all of these communities that creates people that are confident leaders that aren't affiliated with a party boss, and those people meeting each other and building relationships so that they can go up and do more in a very kind of organic fashion. And I think it's hard to think about it that way. It's hard to think about, it's hard to think about my contribution to global warming driving my car from place to place. It's hard to imagine how small of an impact, this can't possibly matter and all of that, but it obviously does, and we know it does in a whole bunch of different areas, and so this is the same thing, right? It's hard to imagine, it's hard to feel like that sometimes, but there were moments, especially when I was in office in South Orange, there were moments where I felt, it wasn't like an accomplishment or a program that we were working on, but it was something that, in the beginning, for example, when I ran, there was an issue around lawn signs. South Orange used to charge a fee to, if you were running for office in South Orange, you had to pay a fee to the town and fill out an application, and that would allow you to allow you to distribute lawn signs to put up. And when I went in there and did that, I said, this doesn't really sound right. And I had a friend of mine who said, let's go to the ACLU, let's do it. I was like, oh, hold on. And I told the clerk at the time, I said, I don't think I have to pay for this. I mean, political speech is protected under the First Amendment. It's one of the most highly protected rights that we have. And I don't think you're allowed to charge, I don't think I have to pay money to be able to put up a lawn sign, which a lawn sign is protected political speech. And so they went back and researched it and emailed me back and said, oh, it turns out, Mr. Torpey, thank you, it turns out you were correct, and we're going to be refunding the other people's money who's paid this year, and you're free to basically do whatever you're going to do. I said, great, and I wrote down and promised myself that when I got elected, that I would try and repeal that ordinance in South Orange. Unfortunately, I couldn't. We took it up, and our attorney provided an opinion that said this violates the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, and there's many cases all around New Jersey where judges have specifically struck down local laws, specifically that are exactly the same, as South Orange is. That you can't charge people money, that you can't ask for applications, that you can't limit how many signs you put up. You can put up as many signs as you want. And there's like a couple things that they can limit, which is you can't put it, in the public right of way, and you can't put a billboard on your front lawn, right? There's basically a determination that at a certain size, you've made your point, and you're not protected to make that point any bigger than that. But everybody can see it, and that's the point of the lawn sign, right? But everything else, you can't limit those things. And so we tried to do that, and there were some members of the governing body at the time who that didn't matter, I guess, that it was unconstitutional. They were worried that people would put up too many lawn signs, and they didn't like that. And I remember saying, it doesn't really matter what we like. I mean, this is the United States Constitution. And it was an interesting, so we never ended up repealing it. It was one of the only times I think that I've ever gotten to say, when I was village president, this is something that violates the United States Constitution, and based on the advice of our attorney, I've directed all municipal staff not to enforce this, and if anybody notices anyone in any South Orange staff enforcing this, contact me and we'll have to work that out because they're not allowed to. It was the only time I got to say, okay, fine, don't change the law, but I'm the CEO, and we're not going to do that. Our attorney is telling us this is unconstitutional. And it was a moment that was a little disappointing because we didn't repeal the ordinance, and I was just kind of banging my head against the wall. How could people not see that? But on the other hand, it was a moment where I got to participate in government where the United States Constitution was the subject. And that is incredible. I mean, I've read about it in books, I've read it itself, I've heard politicians quote it all the time. They love quoting it and talking about how much it means to them, and they all carry a pocket.
And ignoring it.
Right, and then ignoring it. And we got, but I got this opportunity to, it wasn't oh, this violates, New Jersey Statute 21-3. This was the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. And I just remember being involved with that and talking about that with the attorney, and at one point, we looked at a constitution, and I was just this is incredible that I've been given this opportunity to participate in government, and it made me feel like what I was doing was part of a bigger history,
Like
right?
one of the founding fathers.
That's what it felt like. That's what it felt like a little bit. It felt like being, a statesman, not a politician, when you're dealing in that way. And so anyway, so that was just an experience I thought I would share that's relevant to the.
Welcome to politics.
What was the argument that went out? What was the reason?
The argument, it was basically, because we had to change the law, we required, an affirmative vote for it. And the reasoning was that if we were to pull that ordinance, then it would be kind of a free-for-all with lawn signs. And none of us had ever identified a problem with that. You have little disputes here and there with neighbors sometimes, but there wasn't some huge outcry of lawn signs everywhere. And so it didn't really seem like a problem that we needed to address. And the fact that the whole thing was unconstitutional, I guess it didn't matter. It was what if someone puts up 100 lawn signs? Said, I don't know, what if a journalist criticizes you? I mean, they're allowed to, things can happen that you don't like. That's part of living in a democratic society, so that the people that are in charge don't get to say what other people get to do. And if you want to put up 100 lawn signs, and that's your political speech, and fine. I mean, great, I'm glad that person is exercising their speech. That's a good thing, but that's not the argument that went out.
Wouldn't it be possible, though, to reasonably limit the length of time the signs are displayed prior to a particular election, and then require that they be removed afterward? I think the ordinance in West Orange, it's 3 weeks before, and they have to be gone a week afterward, something like that.
Yeah, that's one of the stipulations that's been found to be unconstitutional as well. Yeah, you can't limit the time. So I don't think there are any towns that don't have that on the books. We have it here too. And unfortunately, I don't know how to answer that. It's one of the reasons why I want to go to law school, because I'm kind of curious to answer questions like this, because to posit it, to limit the amount of time, it's a judgment call based on whether you've made your speech or not, which isn't impossible, right? All of our rights have limitations at a certain point, all the amendments have limitations, and so that's not impossible to conceive of some sort of limitation, but how you structure that and when, the judgment call on when is the right time, when you allow the person to do it. Okay, let's say we say that the 6 weeks even is the time, so now it's 6 weeks around. What about when the person announces their campaign? Should you be able to make a political statement at that point as a resident, even though it's a year away from the election? What if some major scandal happens from the opponent and you want to be able to put a lawn sign up showing your support of the other person? And so there's all these complications that I got to imagine that there might be a way to do that, but the way that towns have done it doesn't meet that constitutional criteria. And I haven't seen something, although I'd love to see like ideas on it, of how you could manage this in a way that allows people their political speech, but also understands that that if there's a community that feels like there's some negative value to having those signs up all the time, that there's some way to compromise on that. But yeah, but the time limit laws are basically are not allowed to be enforced, although a lot of towns do it. But it's part of the same thing.
Alex, we want you to run for office. We need you. We need you.
Well, I'm helping other people run for office right now, so hopefully that's
You
doing
have to
my
have
part.
more vacation.
Yeah, I'll do more of that too.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for
Yeah.
coming. You enlightened us about politics.